Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our March Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I'm part of the leadership team of JustFaith Ministries. My co-host tonight is Heidi Villaluz, and we're delighted you could join us. Let's begin our program this evening with prayer. This one comes from one of our programs, Faith and Immigration Justice. We begin by reading a reflection by Joan Maruskin of the United Methodist Women. This reflection is an adaptation of Psalm 137, which describes the grief of God's people upon their exile to the land of their oppressors. In the original passage, the Israelites yearn for their home and for those they have been forced to leave behind, vowing to never forget who they are despite the taunts of their enemies. Let us pray. By the waters of the Rio Grande, there we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our guitars, for there the border patrol asked us for songs and the vigilantes asked for laughter, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? By the waters we weep and remember. We remember Mexico and El Salvador. We remember Honduras and Darfur. We remember Colombia and Bosnia. We remember Cuba and Haiti. We remember China and Romania. By the waters we remember. On the willows we hung up our guitars. We hung up our hopes. We hung up our hoes, our land, our dreams. We hung up our poverty, our hunger, our thirst. We hung up our friends, our traditions, our culture. We hung up our family ties, our food, our language. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We sing only the song of the homeless, the unemployed, the laments of hunger and thirst, of death and destruction, the songs of the songless, the hungry, the thirsty, the songs of the lonely, the songs of the dying. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? We light this candle in honor of our immigrant friends and neighbors and family members who are far from the places they call home and who are targeted by cruel and unjust immigration policies. As we continue through our time together this evening, we hold these loved ones in our hearts as we allow Dr. Cecilia's words to guide our way
This time it's not going
away.
away.
Solidarity, and justice seeking. Amen. And now Heidi will share a few logistics about tonight's gathering.
Amen. Thank you, Jack. So just a reminder to folks, or if this is your first time letting you know that the event this evening is being recorded and you'll receive an email on Monday with the recording as well as links to any of the resources that Dr. Cecilia is going to share this evening. We'll invite you to drop questions into the chat for Dr. Cecilia, and we'll collect them and we'll have a time of Q&A after the presentation. And so feel free to drop them in and know that we're collecting them as we go. And we'll also provide some time at the end to drop more questions to her. We're going to invite everyone to remain muted during the presentation because of the large volume of folks who are here. We want to make sure that the audio is working for everyone. And so you can send messages to myself or Jack or drop them in the chat if you are in need of any assistance. And then finally, we also thank everyone who's donated to continue to making these incredibly impactful and important webinars possible. And so Acting for Justice, if you've been enjoying it for a while and would like to help us keep bringing relevant and impactful webinars to each month, we're going to drop a link into the chat. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. And so if you've been enjoying them for a while and you want to help us keep it going, consider making a donation tonight or in the future. And I'll hand it back to Jack.
Thanks, Heidi. So now it's my pleasure to reintroduce all of us to tonight's presenter, who was also our January presenter. By popular demand, Dr. Cecilia was asked to return. Theologian Cecilia González-Andrieu is a leading scholar of theological aesthetics, which she proposes as a way to bring communities together, respect and celebrate oneness, and lift the theological insights of those who know and express themselves from the peripheries. She's one of the contributing writers for America Magazine, penning a number of significant essays on political theology, Latinx theologies, and women's issues. Her book, Bridge to Wonder, Art as a Gospel of Beauty, has received international acclaim. Dr. Cecilia teaches in Loyola Marymount University's Department of Theological Studies. She co-chairs the LMU Latino Theology and Ministry Initiative. She's an active participant of the Ignatian Solidarity Network and an advisor for the Discerning Deacons Project. Dr. Cecilia, we're so glad you could come back. Welcome.
Thank you, Jack and Heidi. And I'm very glad that the conversation that we had in January got everyone thinking about these issues around migration, and you asked me to return. And so I also want to thank everyone who's here, because clearly, right, you care about the suffering of the vulnerable. You've made time to be here, and I am very grateful for that. Me. So I've titled this The Rightly Formed Conscience, Responding to the Call of Faith in Solidarity with Immigrants. And as a community of communities, and I know that we have people from all different faith traditions and denominations, I am speaking as a Roman Catholic theologian, but I hope that what I have to say will resonate with you. And I want to go back to the insight that Pope Paul VI had and was immortalized by the great artist Corita Kent, where he made sure that we understood that if we wanted peace, we needed to work for justice. And Paul VI's address, right, it was almost 50 years ago, and it was full of hope for a world that was changing. He stated that every person of his time knew they were a person. They felt they were a person, an inviolable being, equal to others, free and responsible, a sacred being. And the world did indeed seem to be changing. He said that developing countries shouted out with a loud voice, it is the voice of peoples, the voice of humanity. It demands a new expression of justice, a new foundation for peace. And it seemed like we were moving toward human rights in all spheres. As theologian Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru had asserted just a few years before, the work of theological reflection requires that we allow ourselves to be judged by the Word of God, think through our faith, make our love more abundant, and witness to the reason for our hope from within a commitment that is more radical, complete, and practical. Now, these are the foundations on which we stand today. Not the shaky foundations of political parties or of slogans, but on the solid understanding that the inviolable dignity and equality of all human beings is a known, non-negotiable truth of our faith. And this truth needs to judge all we do and lead us into critical thought and action. Now, if we fast forward 4 decades from Paul VI, we have the election of a new pope, who, as a Latin American Jesuit, he had himself gone through a process of radical conversion to the plight of the most vulnerable. It's 2013, and the new pope is making his first official trip And unexpectedly, it is to a tiny island off the coast of Italy. Lampedusa is just 80 miles from Tunisia and the closest European land to the African continent. And on that day, Pope Francis grips the world's attention as he looks out at the sea. He explains why he is there. Immigrants dying at sea in boats, which were vehicles of hope and became vehicles of death. That is how the headlines put it. When I first heard of this tragedy a few weeks ago and realized that it happens all too frequently, it has constantly come back to me like a painful thorn in my heart. I don't want to move. I'm trying here. Okay. So I felt that today I had to come here today to pray and to offer a sign of my closeness, but also to challenge our consciousness, lest this tragedy be repeated. Now, Pope Francis had hope that this challenge would be heard around the world and that the people of goodwill would experience a profound conversion to the cause of the most vulnerable. So in his homily, he continued, the culture of comfort, which makes us think only of ourselves, makes us insensitive to the cries of other people, makes us live in soap bubbles, which, however lovely, are insubstantial. They offer a fleeting and empty illusion, which results in indifference to others. Indeed, it even leads to the globalization of indifference. In this globalized world, we have fallen into globalized indifference. We have become used to the suffering of others. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't concern me. It's none of my business. For the rest of his papacy, Pope Francisco has made the plight of immigrants a central concern for the Church. Migrants and refugees are some of the most vulnerable people in the world, suffering through the convergence of climate devastation and poverty, which results in their displacement. And in this way that he frames it, we now see a fuller understanding of the God-given and sacred dignity that doesn't limit it to humans, but understands it to extend to all of creation. Now, just prior to the pandemic, Pope Francis inaugurated a new monument in St. Peter's Square meant to confront each of us with the reality of the forcibly displaced person. How can we claim to care for a common home, as he called for in his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si, when we force so many of our brethren to wander the world in constant peril? Finally, just 4 days before being hospitalized for double pneumonia, Pope Francis sent a letter to the bishops of the United States, defiantly confronting the current administration in Washington and Catholic apologists within it who have been justifying the deliberately dehumanizing attack on migrants and refugees. 12 years after Lampedusa, Pope Francis writes prophetically, I have followed closely the major crisis that is taking place in the United States with the initiation of a program of mass deportations. The rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or explicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. At the same time, one must recognize the right of a nation to defend itself and keep communities safe from those who have committed violent or serious crimes while in the country or prior to arrival. That said, the act of deporting people who in many cases have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment damages the dignity of many men and women and of entire families and places them in a state of particular vulnerability and defenselessness. And he continues, this is not a minor issue. An authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment of all people, and that all people deserve, especially the poorest and most marginalized. The true common good is promoted when society and government, with creativity and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable. This does not impede the development of a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration. However, this development cannot come about through the privilege of some and the sacrifice of others. What is built on the basis of force and not on the truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and will end badly. Now, responding directly to statements by the current vice president without naming him, he adds, worrying about personal, community, or national identity apart from the considerations of the infinite dignity of all easily introduces an ideological criterion that distorts social life and imposes the will of the strongest as a criterion of truth. Now, with these foundations that are solid foundations in Catholic social thought or the social gospel, we have a compelling reason to be here, precisely because the rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express disagreement with what is going on in our country surrounding the treatment of our siblings and their dehumanization. Now, in order to gather the tools to exercise this critical judgment to which we are called, I propose to look briefly at 4 intersecting concerns surrounding migration: U.S. immigration policy, root causes and faith, legal challenges, and activating our communities. So let's begin with the very fluid and chaotic context of U.S. immigration policy. Common misunderstandings can be summarized in statements like these. My family came here the right way. People should get in line, and it's not my problem. My suggested response, in order for us to be able to arrive at the critical judgment required by a rightly formed conscience, is to pose some questions back. So let's try this out. When someone asserts that their family came here the right way, our response can be, what time period are we talking about? Are we talking about the 1840s, when 500,000 desperate Irish immigrants came to the eastern U.S. fleeing from the potato famine? And if we are, there were no immigration laws at that point. They came and were received. Or are we talking about the same period out west when the U.S. waged war against Mexico, laying siege to Mexico City? To save their country, Mexico, which until just 2 decades before had been New Spain, was forced to enter into the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding half of its territory. The diverse peoples on those lands, indigenous, Black, Spanish, and their mixed descendants had lived there for at least 375 years. Yet now the people from the East came conquering, absorbing, and displacing them. As members of these historical communities often say, we never crossed the border crossed us. Or are we talking about the last part of the 19th century as the newly seized lands of California experienced a gold rush, igniting a mass migration from China? While there was a boom economy and railroads needed building, these workers were welcomed. But soon sentiment turned against them, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. This banned almost all Chinese from entering the country, even to reunite with established families. Astonishingly, this act was not repealed until 1943. And this was the very first law restricting migration. Now, back on the eastern side of the US, in a period of 50 years, about 25 million more people migrated from Europe. There were no laws applying to any of these groups, and only individuals might be turned away, such as prostitutes or convicts. And out of those 25 million, only 1% were turned away. However, as the 20th century moved forward, nativist public sentiment turned against immigrants once more. And in hopes of discouraging migration, laws were passed requiring European immigrants to pass the literacy test. In addition, a so-called Asiatic barred zone was created affecting most of Asia. Now, please note that none of these immigration policies affected the American continent. From Canada down to Tierra del Fuego, there were no laws controlling the free flow of peoples in the Americas. Now, it's in the 1920s, following the surge of desperate refugees fleeing the First World War, that quotas were first put in place. And again, the American continent was not part of this quota system. Now, the racist underpinnings of much immigration law are very apparent when we look at these years and how the quotas boosted Northern European numbers while largely denying African and Asian migration through the use of complex formulas. And so it was not until the 1920s that the first laws of deportations, visas, and border patrol were created. Now, the Second World War, with its complicated global character, resulted in many new immigration measures, such as the Alien Registration Program. Immigration, which had been seen as largely tied to economic issues and handled by the Department of Labor, was reconstituted as a security issue and moved to the Department of Justice. The war also prompted some of the most shameful chapters in U.S. history with Executive Order 9066, which forcibly detained Japanese Americans in internment camps. Families who were American citizens lost their homes, jobs, and businesses and were forcibly imprisoned. With labor shortages brought on by the war and by the internment camps, in 1942, the Bracero program was instituted to recruit hundreds of thousands of agricultural workers. After just a few years earlier, during the Depression, many Mexicans and Mexican Americans had been deported. The workers were given no rights or a path to permanent residence. They were exploited. They were charged for room and board, so they were practically indentured, and they were exposed to dangerous chemicals. Again, with xenophobic sentiment on the rise, the Eisenhower administration carried out the offensively named Operation Wetback in 1954. As the Los Angeles Times of that period reported, Border patrolmen and immigration officers acting on intelligence gathered over a period of months will sweep through factories into Skid Row saloons and hotels and ferret out illegal Mexican aliens in other Los Angeles locations. Now, 63 years later, a very different Los Angeles Times took stock, reporting that the Eisenhower-era operation was accompanied by scores of deaths and shattered families. In some cases, U.S. citizens were apprehended and deported alongside unauthorized immigrants. Raids were concentrated in border communities, but stretched as far north as St. Louis. And in the pre-civil rights era, few spoke up on behalf of immigrants. In the middle of all this, there were also some humanitarian legislation passed, principally the 1948 Displaced Persons Act, which is the first asylum legislation, but it was a temporary bill following the war that admitted about 200,000 displaced persons and also allowed some persons already in the country to regularize their status. And then the 1953 Refugee Relief Act, which again provided about 200,000 visas for refugees, primarily from Europe, but some designated also for the Far East. And this was then followed by some targeted programs for refugees from communist dictatorships. Now, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 is the first time that any caps on migration are applied to the American continent. And it creates a system of preferences in place until very recently, which are family reunification, employment, and refugees in that order. It is the first time limits are set for Latin America. Now, the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was a bipartisan agreement that allowed almost 3 million persons without status to normalize their status while increasing border enforcement and employer requirements, but it did not address the underlying issues in need of comprehensive immigration reform. Now, in the 1990s, immigration law, a special category of temporary protective status, was created, and this was for asylum seekers, but temporary, with possible renewals, but not providing any kind of a path to regular status. And this is one of the most painful situations today, because although the Biden administration, as he was leaving office, sought to protect these populations by extending their TPS status for 18 months. Some have already been revoked, including for places where people are in grave danger, like Venezuela and Haiti. And all the others are set to expire in the next few months. Now, during the late 1990s, more laws were passed tightening employer sanctions and creating a cascading effect of constant immigration upheaval. Repeated attempts at immigration reform, including the Bipartisan DREAM Act for young people, were defeated. And Barack Obama created the DACA program through an executive order that has been repeatedly challenged, but which the courts have allowed to stand, although no new applications have been processed. So as is clear, immigration is one of the most volatile areas of U.S. policy. So I recommend each of you spend some time with the U.S. post-war immigration policy timeline that was put together by the Council on Foreign Relations. And we will give you those links. So this makes our second response very clear. When someone says that people should get in line, our answer is there a line? As you can see in this chart, and this is a real chart, the process is extraordinarily complicated. It's lengthy, it's costly, and all of the red boxes show when denial can happen. Additionally, the Trump administration is changing the rules as they go. And in cases such as the very recent case where they are trying to actually deport a legal resident for his free speech rights, for political activism, they're acting in ways that are unconstitutional. So finally, we get to the statement of "it's not my problem," which Pope Francis alluded to. And clearly each one of you is here because you know it is your problem. So your question back, and what all of the religious organizations working on this right now want you to do, is to reach out to that person and ask them if they're a person of faith, and start the conversation there. The first tool that we learn of being able to trace out immigration history and its arbitrariness, racism, and cycles of xenophobia can help us contextualize that to, quote, do things the right way is often not an option, and that our ancestors came in very different circumstances. Our second tool of understanding that the get in line idea is most often an impossibility and would keep people apart from their loved ones for decades should help us address the reality of hopelessness that our current immigration system has created. The third tool of appealing to faith is one that applies in a specific way to us and to the work we're being commissioned to do in our parishes, our churches, schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods. Our appeal to faith can then allow us to move beyond partisanship and into the social gospel. Catholic social teaching and the social gospel are based on practices of Jesus and his community, and they invite us to look for the root causes of suffering. And forced human migrations may have many root causes, principally violence, famine, persecution, the need for family reunification, and oppression. So a helpful way to look at this is to review the situation we're looking at and ask, who benefits from this and who suffers from it? So let's first look at who benefits. We have corporations which thrive on low-wage labor. We have multinational agro-businesses like the ones decimating the Amazonian region so that they can take possession of the land. We have human trafficking cartels that make lots of money from the most desperate, who have nowhere else to turn and whose relatives save for years to try to bring them to them. And an even wider society that benefits because we buy cheap goods and pay cheap prices for services. So just a few minutes looking at the US economy will reveal all of these root causes. Now let's look at who suffers. Families are separated and live in heartbreaking conditions. Workers are exploited and forced to work multiple jobs. People are forced into the shadows without any access to social services. And mixed status families where some members lack required authorization most often parents and grandparents, live in constant fear. Now, in 2017, Pope Francisco established a special section within the Vatican for the urgent work of caring for migrants and refugees. And I'm going to highlight some of their extremely simple, overarching principles. First, people should be free to stay in their own lands. Forced migration and displaced peoples means being forced from one's land by any of the root causes we just described. However, Pope Francisco is explicit about what is necessary for people to be able to stay and thrive in their own countries. What he calls the 3 T's: tierra, techo, trabajo, some land, shelter, and work. When these necessities of life are missing, people are forced to migrate. Second, people should be free to move to sustain life and the lives of their families. Immigrant rights are human rights, so preserving life is primordial. And when conditions cannot sustain a dignified life, people should have a right to migrate in search of better conditions. This is the history of all of humanity. And to curtail this right directly causes suffering and death. People today have to move because of multiple armed conflicts erupting. And we can count our own country among those severely threatened by violent disruption. Poverty and the widening economic gap have created conditions where 10% of the world's population doesn't have access to safe and nutritious food. And of course, the wars and the hunger are related to the growing instability of our climate and the loss of ecosystems and habitats with economic consequences. And the third point, people should be free to return. Of course, the focus here is on freedom as necessary for human dignity, and that people should be free of all coercion. Now, there are 4 action points that we are to follow, and we heard Pope Francis allude to those in his letter. And this is where each of you has to think of your own local communities, both the needs and the opportunities, for how we go from here with these action points. First, welcome. What can you do to create a welcoming climate for migrants? Migration should be safe, legal, and orderly, and the decision to migrate is voluntary. Second, protect. What can you do to fulfill the duty to protect migrants that is grounded in the centrality of the human person? Third, promote. It isn't enough to arrive at a new place. The dignity of persons requires that we work to help those staying long-term to develop as human beings and also to contribute to society. And the fourth, integrate. Now, this doesn't mean erasing anyone's roots. It means creating the conditions for them to be full members of the community, enriching the community, and undoing systems that perpetuate marginality. So I also want to encourage you to become well-versed on the theological and faith-based foundations for the Church's teaching on migration. And for that, the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the United States is building a really comprehensive hub of materials to help all people of goodwill to have robust tools for caring for our neighbor. What is happening in our world right now is overwhelming. But we need to stay on top of the legal challenges because they are some of our best hope for relief for the most vulnerable. Now, one of the most helpful dashboards is from the New York Times, and we're only going to look at immigration, although it covers many other concerns. There are 9 cases right now challenging the Trump administration on ending birthright citizenship, and several courts have issued temporary injunctions. And just today, one of these cases has reached the Supreme Court. There are 24 cases on multiple immigration-related questions, and likely a few more since I last checked a few hours ago. And again, some judges have granted temporary injunctions. Now, among these, there are 4 of particular interest that I want us to look at. One is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops because of the government's failure to provide the funds already spent for refugee resettlement. The Catholic Charities in Texas case is similarly focused. The United Farm Workers case, which is against raids and racial profiling, it's a civil rights case. And then the case headed up by the Mennonite Church and joined by many other faith groups, which is about the administration having rescinded the sensitive spaces guidance and allowing immigration arrests in places of worship. So now, because of time, I'm going to close with a fast list of what you can do. First, stay informed. This is a constantly updated website put together by Catholic Charities in San Diego, and they will be adding things every hour if they have to. We will make sure I get all of these links for you. Show up and speak up. If you can, we just did this a few weeks ago down in the Diocese of San Diego, and if you can put together public witnesses around our actual Jubilee year that are in connection with migration, do that. Bring your communities out for that. Cultivate community and a sense of our kingship. In every space that you can be, try to have that be a mixed space. Invite the ones who are vulnerable into the spaces. Create community. Volunteer with immigrants' rights organizations. Find the ones that are near you. This is obviously the Kino Border Initiative, which is an amazing one that's on the border, but there's many, many others, and there might be some that are very local to your area. Teach others. I have envisioned this time that we've spent together as me commissioning you to take all of this knowledge and then spread it around and teach others, bring them along. You can also train to provide for pastoral care. This is something that is just getting off the ground with the training to minister to the incarcerated, especially to those being held in immigration detention. Raise money. All of these organizations need help. The Catholic Relief Services, Jesuit Refugee Services, everybody right now needs help because so much of their funding has been cut. And then highlight the beauty of others. People don't want to just be seen as a burden or as sad. They want us to love them because there is profound beauty in them and in their culture and in what they bring to us. And every opportunity that you can have to highlight their beauty, take that opportunity. And then just be light. Be the one that's going to give the welcome, that's going to create spaces, that's going to make it possible for those who feel like they have nowhere to go. You're welcome. We love you. Thanks.
Thank you so incredibly much, Dr. Cecilia, and feel very fortunate to have taken all of this and also motivated as to be commissioned to go out and share this with others. And so we've been sharing some of the resources and the links in the chat. We've had a couple questions drop in, and so we are going to come to some Q&A time with Dr. Cecilia. And so continue to add your applause and your kudos in there. So there's some thanks coming in, and also your questions. And while you're adding your questions, we'll be sharing about some upcoming opportunities to give you a couple of minutes. And so next week, we will be hosting a program information session on our Faith and Immigration Justice program. And so if your community is ready for the next step, or if you yourself have more questions and you're ready to take another step and would like to become better equipped and better informed to respond to this moment, we'll help you to pull together a group of 14 individuals. It does not need to be tied to any institution, and we'll help you get started on your journey to becoming more informed and more compassionate advocates in your community. There we go. The link in the QR code is there. We will send everything out in the follow-up email as well. But this is a great time to take a next step. You heard Dr. Cecilia, we're all commissioned, so consider some of these as your next steps. Another special event, we have 2 unique events coming up in April. The next is a bilingual leader listening session. As Jack mentioned, and we've mentioned in the past, we're developing our first Spanish-English bilingual program to be released early summer of this year. This could be one of those great ways to provide that welcoming environment in your communities. And so on April 2nd, we were going to host a bilingual listening session on Zoom. We are looking for individuals who have completed at least one of JFM programs, so they have an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about our programs. They're fluently bilingual in Spanish and English. They're willing to share candidly about the experiences of rolling out new programs, not necessarily JFM programs, but ministries, other programs in their community in Spanish. And while the session will not be exclusive, we also want to prioritize and uplift the voices of those who identify as Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latinx. And so it's going to be held on Wednesday, April 2nd. It will be held in English. We're going to gather input about the day and time. There's a QR code. There's a link there that will also go out. So either please sign up yourself if you find yourself in those categories, or share with folks in your community that you think whose experiences and perspectives really help inform our work and empower more communities to create welcoming and inclusive spaces. And then finally, in April, we have Save the Date. We'll be sending out more information. We're going to have a special Acting for Justice prayer night on Thursday, April 10th, and more information to follow, but it will definitely be a time to gather and uplift the many battles that we're facing this Lent, and the work that we're doing, and gather some time to prepare ourselves going into Holy Week. And so finally, we all know that 2025 is going to continue being a difficult year. And so whether we're addressing immigration, poverty, racism, hunger, we all have a lot of work to do. And so as we do our work, it's going to be critical to be well informed, to invite others into becoming faith in action. And so know that JustFaith Ministries is always ready to help. So if you're new here today, most warm welcome. We encourage you to come to our website, look through the portfolio programs that we offer. There's never been a more critical time for the work of education and justice for people of faith. And so consider bringing one of the programs, perhaps immigration, perhaps another, to your church or community. We thank you for being here to be educated, but we want you to amplify your voice and live your faith in action by bringing 8 to 12 people along with you, and it makes your voice 8 to 12 times more powerful. And again, you don't have to be an expert on any of the topics. The resources are so well put together that we want you to be facilitator participants. Just anyone can pick it up and get started. And if it's not you, please pass the information, forward an email, share the information, pass along to others in your community to amplify, take what you've learned here today and amplify your voice more. And so I'm going to hand it back to Jack and Dr. Cecilia, and we're going to collect. We have some questions that are coming into the chat, and One of the ones that came in early on, before you started giving some of the action items, but if you want to say anything more about that, one of the first questions that came in is, what can we say or do for immigrants we know who are in a daily state of fear and uncertainty?
Well, and I know a lot of people in that state right now. So the more informed that you are, the more helpful that you can be. So let them know that you are present to them and that you are keeping yourself informed, because that's one of the greatest difficulties for immigrants. Often it's not only the language barrier, but it's also the difficulty of understanding how our laws function, how our country functions, our civil rights, any of that, right? Because they're coming very often. They're here because they're fleeing terrible situations, and they don't even have experiences of democracy. So we can tell when democracy is being trampled, but they don't. And they think some things are just normal. Now, there's a website called PolitiFact, that also has a section in Spanish as well. It will do it as well. And one of the things that they do, they're a nonprofit, and they will check the kinds of misinformation that is out there, and they will give you, right, this is a false thing, this is a false, or this is true. But most of the time, they're talking about a lot of false information out there. That's a very difficult thing right now for people who are feeling very vulnerable, because things just go like wildfire. And one of the things I'm encouraging people to do is to double check everything before you spread it. So the more informed you are, the more that you can be present, the more that you can help debunk misinformation, and then offer to accompany people in whatever it is that they may need, because the fear factor is very real. One of the things that I hear very often is people's gratitude when those who are not vulnerable, those who are not going to be racially profiled, are walking with them, who are showing up. There's a great amount of gratitude, because that means that the others are caring about you and also acting as buffers for you. So take that very seriously as well.
Dr. Cecilia, as you are probably well aware, not just the country itself divided, not just the Christian community divided, the Catholic community divided, even those who sort of refer to Catholic social teaching can find themselves divided. And one of the things that comes up frequently, I'm just interested to hear how you respond to this, from those who are supportive of what's currently happening with this administration, cite Catholic social teaching, and it's specifically the point that countries, according to Catholic social teaching, have the right to control their borders. Do you have a reply to that sort of general thought that's offered as a justification for the policies that we see today?
Well, I mean, Pope Francis says it in his letter. It's also in the Catholic Principles on Migration on the USCCB's website. That right is conditioned on treating immigrants with their full human rights. It can never be over the rights of immigrants. So whatever we do for controlling borders, and everyone wants, as Pope Francis said, everyone wants orderly and peaceful migration. What we don't want is what is going on right now, which is dehumanizing, right? Taking away the humanity of people in order to be able to then control borders, right? And rather than to say, which again, this has been a historical thing of trying new ways to exclude people, but never doing a comprehensive way of saying, how do we create a system that functions, and that will allow families to be reunified, that will allow people to come who are seeking work, that will allow refugees to come in, right? All of these things we know are necessary, but we refuse to do the hard work of creating the laws and the paths to do it. So we can't do it on by trampling the dignity of human beings, no matter who they are, because we need to put ourselves in their space and say, if everything went really wrong today, right here, and I needed to get out with my family, what would I do? How would I feel? Well, that's how they feel.
Right. Dr. Cecilia, one of the, and I'm again just interested in your input on this. There are a lot of folks, of course, weighing in on what do we do? What's the best thing to do? What's the most important thing to do? And I'm thinking right now just about sort of the whole matter of charitable giving. Something I bumped into frequently over the last couple of weeks has been the importance of providing funding for those organizations that are doing the, who are actually doing the legal work. Because as you mentioned, I think in your presentation, so much hangs in the balance on how some of these decisions go, and that there is adequate legal representation and argument, et cetera. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of engage that comment and offer your own advice.
Well, yes, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, right, hey, let's raise the money, for Catholic relief services, for Catholic charities, for the immigrant law clinics, and let's be creative about how we raise the money for them. And because we do need, right now, we need everybody working. And we just, we're creative about raising money, so let's do it, and let's get it to the places that need it. And especially Catholic Relief Services right now, they have put out a very big emergency call, right? Because people are dying around the world because of the cut of funding from USAID. So whatever we can do to help to feed starving kids and to get medicine to people, let's do that. And let's put ourselves, whatever time or treasure we have, at the service of this.
Heidi, have you got any more questions? I'm spent here, so we'll jump in if you have some.
We got a couple more. One of them, I think, has come up in Dr. Cecilia's work also in examining where we are in this current moment. Are there examples of helping move people away from white supremacy, and I'll add Christian nationalism, toward this biblical theological approach?
Well, I don't know about examples other than to say that any kind of supremacy is completely anti-biblical. And so I do think that trying to get people to think about their own histories, like we did right now, right? What was it like for the Irish? How was it like for the Italians? To realize where they come from, to realize the kingship that we all have as human creatures, and to undo these structures of power that we feel are the thing we have to have, right? We have to have power. Well, if we can experience the beauty of kingship and community, and that's why I point us to building these connections with each other, it will feel good. And people will return and do more of it because they will feel good. Now, one of the things that I want to be very practical about inviting you all to do, every one of you that's in a church community, or a parish community, school community, should be forming a committee right now. I have called it here, our love of neighbor. You give it whichever name you want to give it, but that committee should be looking at concrete ways in which your community in your local space could be helping and could be doing things. And whether it's that, you're doing Know Your Rights workshops, whether it's you're accompanying people to the court, whether you are helping them to fill out papers, whatever it is, there's multiple ways to help. So creating a group that will be in charge of that in conjunction with your clergy, and getting that, and also, right, encouraging. And that's why I also pointed you to the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians website, encouraging preaching that is thick, that is meaty, on why this is an actual faith issue and not a political partisanship issue, but it actually affronts the core of what it is to be a Christian person.
Thank you. One of the questions that came in, Hazel writes, how do you respond to allegations that immigrants are taking advantage of resources they do not deserve, or are depriving legitimate American citizens of their resources?
Yeah, so I would refer you to the talk from January, because we covered that, and to the tape from that. But the very simple answer is none of that is true. And you can go, to the website for the Center for Migration Studies, which is from the Scalabrini Order, or any of these other really great think tanks. But bottom line is, immigrants are a great boon to economies. They give so much, and they pay so much in taxes. These are undocumented persons now, which they can never take out in social services. So today I was just hearing about, the 53 million annually that they put in just in a small place like El Paso, but they don't have the social services or the social security numbers to take any of it out. They do not have access to social services, and that is a misconception. And in most cases, even when they might, like parents who have US-born children, they might stay away because they're fearful, right? So these economic questions are not true. And so what we have to do is do the research and get the numbers. And again, I think I gave you a lot of numbers on the first, on the January talk, so that you can refute that with facts. And that's what we want to do.
Let me just remind the listeners, Cecilia, that your talk from January is available on our website. So just let people know that they can find that talk at justfaith.org. Someone was just asking about how to get a parish talk together, started to raise awareness in the parish, and maybe convert some people to recognize the full humanity of those who are currently being excluded. And questions like who should the presenters be and what should be covered. Let me just jump in. I'm just thinking from our experience, one way to get started is to contact the local, for example, Catholic Charities office, because a lot of Catholic Charities offices around the country do this kind of work and have somebody available. Cecilia, do you have anybody else, any other strategy that you'd recommend on the local level?
Well, yes, I mean, looking for the local Catholic Charities it's a wonderful start, but also you can look at some of immigrant organizations near you. But if you, let's say that you don't have any of those resources near you, you have a computer, you have these videos, we have so many great organizations doing work. Put it together, sit with it, have yourself the courage to lift your voice and say, okay, we're going to talk about love of neighbor. Start there, and start with the Good Samaritan, and invite people to come and think about, okay, what does it mean for us to live into that? And just let your voice, this is one of the things I love telling my students. You have a wonderful voice. Lift it up. We need you. And I want to really stress that to everybody here, all 100 of you. We need you. You will spread it. You will multiply it. And you will have young people that will be very interested, who may also then take it on, right? Just don't be afraid to begin.
And let me also say, you have a great voice, and so does Dr. Cecilia. And the good news is you're going to have access to this video. So we know all the time that people use these Acting for Justice events, the recordings of them, and bring them back to their parish or back to their community, and they reuse them again. So this is a great resource. What Dr. Cecilia has provided tonight is not just an hour for those of us who happen to be here. It's actually a resource going forward that we can use in the places where we worship and interact. So please take advantage of that fact.
Yeah, and we'll resend out the link. So if you weren't there in January, we'll make sure that you have the recording. You'll have it today. It's a great 2-part series that you can start it, and with amazing resources that Dr. Cecilia shared with us. So you'll have all of those along with the follow-up to this email. We believe in you.
We do.
Heidi, I think we're at the end of our questions, and I just wanted to invite all of those gathered here tonight. I know you're on mute, but if you'd offer Dr. Cecilia another hand and Thanksgiving for her time with us, we so appreciate it, Dr. Cecilia. It's been just a fabulous resource and great information, and just so appreciate your time, effort, and your passion and compassion. So thank you for being with us. Let us all close now with a prayer. This prayer also comes from our small group program, Faith and Immigration Justice, which I might mention again in the spirit of Dr. Cecilia's advice is a good way to get informed, stay informed, and catch up. So let me recommend it, and let us close with this prayer. As people of faith, we work not only to form a just society that is inclusive, but also to transform unjust structures that are exclusive. As people of change, we work to hear the voices of those on the margins, joining our voices with theirs, listening to them for guidance and leadership. As people of hope, give us the courage not to remain silent in the midst of injustice, apathetic toward great need, nor paralyzed by the immensity of the problem. As a people of prayer, may unceasing prayer accompany all of our actions as we work together to bring about God's kingdom of justice and peace. Lord, you have given all people one common origin, and your will is to gather them as one family in yourself. Set our hearts on fire with the desire to ensure justice for all our siblings. Empower us to share what we have received from you, that we might rejoice in that day and leap for joy at the coming of your kingdom. Amen. Thank you all for being with us tonight, and have a good evening.